I would like to introduce our first speaker. He's a legal director for CAIR-New York, the Council on American Islamic Relations. He was kind enough to speak at our Day of Remembrance event in February and also at our Fred T. Korematsu Day on January 30th. And now I'd like to welcome Albert Cahn.
Thank you so much. It's surreal being in the space on this week in particular, because a few days ago we heard lawyers going to court in Washington, D.C., to our highest court, to the Supreme Court, and debating whether the President of the United States has the power to violate the most fundamental rights of individuals on the basis of a thinly veiled pretext of national security, but truly out of bigotry and bias. Many of the questions we heard before the Supreme Court in the Muslim ban oral arguments on Wednesday could have been asked in the Hirabashi case, in the Korematsu case, and still, all these decades later, we are seeing the same fundamental challenge, whether our system of laws, whether our courts will stand up to the president's pretext of national security at the moment when it matters most. When unpopular minority groups are being targeted for who they are and what they believe. But the Trump administration didn't simply ask the court to uphold the Korematsu decision. It didn't simply ask them to reenact history. It asked the court to go farther, to rule that the president's Muslim ban, his third attempt at a Muslim ban, is not only permitted by the facts on the ground, it's not merely permitted by the threat he claims to see from Muslim-majority countries, but that the very question of whether this ban is constitutional is beyond the scope of the court's power. They would have the court defer completely, to write a blank check, to abandon its fundamental purpose under our system of government, and to yield to the president the authority to decide what national security threats justify what national security responses. For us at CAIR-New York, for all the civil rights groups across the country that have been fighting this Muslim ban, who have been fighting for the rights of immigrant New Yorkers, who have been fighting for the basic principles of our Constitution, it was a heartbreaking moment. Heartbreaking because, as you may have seen, many of the commentators think that the court will rule to uphold the ban. But though we're concerned by the nature of the questions being put forward, you must keep in mind that there's a long line of brilliant commentators looking at the oral arguments, making broad pronouncements, and being utterly wrong. Those who think they can predict the court with any certainty are doomed to get egg on their face, and I hope that will be the case here. You only have to look back to the Affordable Care Act debates, the decision there that took many by surprise. But let me recap the situation on the ground today, and then I'll leave lots of time for questions, because I know this is something that has been in the news quite a bit. As it exists today, there is a ban on visa applications for individuals from 6 Muslim-majority countries, well, 5 Muslim-majority countries because of the removal of Chad, and 2 non-Muslim majority countries. But those 2 non-Muslim majority countries, North Korea and Venezuela, have been added as window dressing, as a distraction. The restrictions there are so narrowly tailored, they will only impact maybe at most a couple hundred, as opposed to the thousands of applicants being targeted from countries like Yemen. And this ban is having a dramatic impact on the lives of New Yorkers every day. There are men and women in this city who are separated from loved ones and don't know when or if they will ever see them again. Their lives in limbo, some who were just days away from bringing them to security here in the United States. We have clients who, when the Supreme Court reinstated the Muslim ban back in December and we broke the news to them, broke into tears. They were ready to give up hope. But the truth is that no matter how the court rules, there will still be hope going forward, because there will still be the opportunity to rectify this ban. Not merely in the ballot box, not merely in Congress, but through popular democratic movements that show the resolve of the American people not to accept this sort of unconstitutional discrimination. This is going to be a generational moment. Our response to this decision will be a generational moment. And while I'm hopeful that come June, the court will be striking down the Muslim ban, that they will be saying that this is an unconstitutional act, it may not be that easy. This may be the prelude to the fight that determines the very nature of our Constitution for future generations. I want to see if anyone has specific questions that I can answer about the ban, about the oral arguments, about the ways the decisions could go. Does anyone have any questions about where things stand and the specific contours of the arguments? Yes, sir.
He passed the executive order. How come the Congress and Senate cannot stop these executive?
So the question was that the president made an executive order, so why can't Congress stop this executive order? Well, we believe that they can, and not only can they, but they actually did already. That in 1965, in the amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act, Congress enacted a provision, I believe it's 1182F, that states that the president cannot discriminate on the basis of several protected characteristics, and one of those characteristics is nationality. They made it clear that they did not want the president to have the ability to discriminate in that way, and we believe that the president's actions under the Muslim ban are a direct violation of that law. And that is something that sets this case apart from the Japanese internment, because in the internment, you had Congress working in concert with the president, passing a statute that made it a crime not to obey an exclusion order promulgated by military authorities. They worked to buttress FDR's discriminatory policy, where here we believe that it is precisely the opposite. But President Trump's lawyers have argued that any restriction on his attempts to implement a Muslim ban are unconstitutional. They have said that even if Congress wishes to act, even if they say that this is a violation of our highest laws, that his powers as commander-in-chief supersede them. And this would be a stunning shift. In the original, in the Korematsu case, the court had decided that they believed it was appropriate to have the internment. It was a vile opinion. We know it is an opinion that has been widely condemned, but there was a concurrence that was far worse by Justice Frankfurt that said, this isn't our area of operations. It doesn't matter if it's constitutional. It went even farther, and that's where the Trump administration would have us go. Hopefully, the court will not take that path, but there is a very real danger that it will. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So if the court rules in favor of the ban, can it be reversed if there's, as we said in the midterm elections, or what is the recourse if there's no consequence?
So the question was, what can we do if the court upholds the ban? Well, it depends on the theory that they use to uphold the ban. So if they say that what President Trump did does not violate federal law, and that's the reason why it's okay, then the answer is clear. A bill in Congress could outlaw the Muslim ban and set in stone that this sort of discrimination is outside the president's authority. If the court goes further and says that it is in the inherent Article 2 power of the president to make this sort of restriction, then it would take impeachment proceedings or a change in the ballot box in order to reverse the ban. And if they take the even broader proposition that it is not within the power of the courts to even review these questions, then it would also take a campaign to change the court. It feels strange as a lawyer to even broach that possibility to even talk about throwing out the court's justices because we disagree with their verdict. But there have been moments in our country's history when that has been the only solution. In the aftermath of Dred Scott, the solution was not simply to obey the court's rules, but to change the very nature of our Constitution, and perhaps an amendment would be necessary. Perhaps a concerted campaign, have more justices, new justices. But there are options. No matter what they rule, no matter how they justify the ruling, we will have ways to push back. Any other questions about the oral arguments or about the Muslim ban today? Yeah.
What are ways that we can support the Muslim community if we're not from that community?
So I think, sadly, we've seen the Muslim ban slip from the headlines. You know, I remember when it first went into effect and everyone raced to the airport. We called for a rally on 24 hours notice and more than 5,000 people came to Washington Square Park, just a few blocks from here. Days later, you had more than 20,000 in Battery Park. We saw this kinetic energy, people just repulsed by what was happening. And then we saw Muslim ban 2.0. And then Muslim ban 3.0, and the wave of court cases. And with each iteration, the Muslim ban became more nuanced, more sophisticated. And all these efforts were being done by the Trump administration to mask the original intent of the ban, to have these more nuanced arguments. But the edifice was just the same. The motivation was just the same, as President Trump's own tweets made clear, to have a ban on Muslim Americans. And so grassroots community efforts to remind the public that not only is the Muslim ban fully in effect, but that there is a real human cost is crucial. And you know, sometimes it can be showing up to rallies, and if in the event the ban is upheld, there will be rallies. But it's engaging on social media. It's pushing back when people try to sanitize it by calling it a travel ban. It's engaging networks of supporters, networks of friends and family who may not be engaged on this issue, especially the ones who you know disagree and support President Trump's executive order. That sort of visible pushback, that sort of visible reminder to the broader New York State community that the Muslim ban is impacting New Yorkers every day is really going to be indispensable as we continue to figure out how to respond and how to move forward. Because right now, you still have thousands suffering, but now they're just suffering in silence. Any other questions? Yes?
What's going to happen if he ever gets impeached and kicked out or supposed to resign? What's going to happen to these executive orders including the Muslim?
So the question is, what will happen if he's ever removed? So an executive order will carry force of law for as long as it is in effect, but just as it can be summarily introduced, as President Trump has shown sometimes on very little notice with very little thought, it can summarily be repealed by his predecessor. So it wouldn't automatically go away if he were to leave office, but his successor on day one, in the first hour of the job, could, with a single sheet of paper, reverse the executive order and undo the Muslim ban. It's really that easy to undo the legal regime he's put into place. Any other questions? Well, I wanted to end on one additional note that I really felt deeply during the oral arguments. There was a moment when the Solicitor General, our nation's top litigator, was explaining the rationale for the Muslim ban, explaining the president's power, explaining how it was beyond the court's authority to even look into these questions. And Justice Elena Kagan asked him, would it be constitutional for an anti-Semitic president to ban Israeli immigrants, to ban Jewish immigrants? And the Solicitor General tried to hem and tried to haw and tried to explain why that wasn't the case and tried to explain all the reasons why that was different. But at the end of the day, he had to concede that, yes, that was constitutional under his theory. And as a Jewish man who works on behalf of the Muslim community, I've long looked to the phrase "never again" in my work. It's something that resonates with my community. It's the sentiment that we must universally fight injustice because of the injustice our community has experienced. And because when we allow injustice to others, we open the door to injustice for ourselves. And we saw in that exchange a stark reminder of how quickly the precedent we are setting today for the Muslim community could be expanded, could be retargeted, could be wielded against another disfavored group, no matter what the reason, no matter what the justification. And in that exchange, we saw a vital reminder that we need to come together. In this moment, when hate and bias are being used to divide, when the presidential power is being abused in this grotesque way, it has never been more important for all New Yorkers, for all Americans, to unite in the principle that we should all be free to practice according to our conscience and to live without the fear that one day, someday, the presidency might come for us. Thank you.